kiss for you.
Just Gems is a series where I highlight various games across the indie and AAA sphere that I feel like got overlooked, either due to their early access launch or their release window maybe not being the best and caught between other titles, or even the launch state of the game maybe not being in the best shape, but the devs kept on the horse and eventually made it better. There are a lot of reasons why players don't necessarily get into a game, so I'm here to highlight why they should give these games a second look. Today we're looking at Gunfire Reborn. The best way I can describe Gunfire Reborn, at least from my own perspective, is it's a combination of Hades in its progression, its weapons, the way the rooms are set up, the way the bosses are done, and the way its upgrade system works and boon system, with the SPF movement, shooter chaos, or something like Doom, with some Risk of Rain in terms of its class design and its ability for you to get very overpowered. It runs very well, is available on all platforms, including the Switch and mobile devices, and has a 4-player online co-op mode. It's also getting frequently updated with new DLC characters which kind of act like classes and new weapons. So if anything that I've said there sounds interesting, then you can definitely go check it out. It's available on Steam. I believe it's also available on Epic Games Store on top of all the other platforms that I mentioned before. It's also pretty cheap. It's usually anywhere from like 18 to 20 bucks. And I would definitely highly recommend that. So if you're just interested in kind of what it was or all that, then that's where the video ends. And now we're kind of talking about some more of those elements. So what I really enjoy about Gunfire Reborn, on top of those elements I just described, is kind of the way that the game feels. It feels, surprisingly, for I believe this developer's first game, very good in terms of the gunplay as well as the movement, right? And also the progression. I think a lot of that has been very well tuned. Something similar to like Risk of Rain and its shooting mechanics, and that it feels very intentional. You're not going to get a lot of missed inputs or kind of weird feeling. Obviously, it's first person, so you're not going to have a bunch of collision or other problems, but it's just really nice to have a shooter that feels very good to play, as well as being very accurate. Enemies are really easy to see, that kind of thing, and so it just is really nice from a gameplay and kind of playing the game perspective. And on top of other things like the progression, again, it's similar to Hades, where you're going to start off with like a weapon that you choose, and you'll get other weapons as you defeat enemies, which I think is a little bit more interesting setup, similar to something like maybe Risk of Rain does. But overall, you'll have a starting weapon. You'll go through the rooms, similar to something like Hades. They're not randomized. They're like pretty, set in stone as you're going through them. But you'll start off with a weapon, go through these different rooms. You'll have occasionally different optional things, like it'll be like a purple spoil that you can attack in the room, and that'll take you to like an optional room or a side objective kind of thing. And then you can come back and complete the room, right? So like it's kind of like a bonus, but other than that, it's a pretty linear setup. You'll go from one room to the next until you get to a boss room, and typically before the boss room, you have an option to buy things from the vendors there, similar to Hades as well. One thing I really like about the vendors is there's an upgrade vendor to upgrade your stuff, and then there's like an items vendor because you are allowed to use certain items. So not like something like Hades, which has one kind of like projectile item that you can use, the little like gem thing you throw. This game has a little bit more, so you can stuff like bombs, as well as different movement things, as well as other things to upgrade your weapons. And so what I really like about it is, unlike something like Hades, your upgrades for your weapons are not only like after the fact. Like typically in Hades, you'll have your weapon, you'll die, and then you'll be able to upgrade your weapon before you start a new run. The weapon kind of upgrades as you're going along, and so I'm not really sure what to compare that to, but ultimately maybe something like Doom, but it's similar where instead of your weapon being stuck as it is, you can upgrade that. So one of the pandas, I think, upgrades your weapon, so you can go from like 1, 2, 3, 4 up to 5, I believe, usually, as long as you have the gold. And so you get gold buffs like defeating enemies. But what I really like about that system is it lets you kind of hold on to a gun longer than you might if there's like an upgrade or something, because the upgrade might give you extra bonuses, almost something similar to like what Terraria does with its upgrade system. You can get maybe an extra crit bonus or an extra health bonus or some other type of modifier when you upgrade the weapon. So maybe you have a weapon that's not that good, but if you upgrade it 2 times, you might get a modifier, crit damage. right? And then maybe you start trying to do a crit build, and all of a sudden that works. So I think that's really interesting. On the build front, I mentioned Risk of Rain here. It's not the two things I'll say for the relation to Risk of Rain is its class design. So every character effectively is a class. It has two abilities that you can use that kind of adjust some things in terms of class abilities as well as health. I believe some of the classes have more health than others, and that's kind of part of their kit. But a lot of the time they'll have like a movement ability, and they'll have like an ultimate. And that ultimate, in this case, a lot of the time I run one that is you're allowed to like dual wield your guns. So like you have two guns and a backup gun, and my ultimate lets you dual wield the guns, right and left click, shoot the guns, and you get like bonuses and stuff. And so that's really good. And overall, I think like the marriage of the kind of structure that Risk of Rain has in terms of its class design with the progression of something like Hades really works in this case, because it really makes you feel like you're getting upgrades, and the upgrades are very useful. Right? A lot of the time, for the upgrades, similar to something like Hades, it'll show you, hey, this boon or whatever that you get is part of like a tree or part of like a setup. So in Hades, you might have like the speed tree. It's, Zephyrus or whatever, and he'll show you a bunch of speed upgrades and that kind of thing. There is a similar one where you kind of pick between 3 different sections, and depending on your class, those sections change. So for example, for my dual wielding class, the 3rd section there talks about dual wielding, right? It's like, oh, improved the dual wielding cooldown and more damage when you dual wield and that kind of thing, and so that helps your ultimate. But a different class might be whatever their ultimate is, and so it's very... There's a lot of good mechanics in the game that you don't really notice until you kind of go through it a good amount of time and realize, oh wow, that's actually really good for me, right? And that's kind of sort of where the more meta progression of Risk of Rain comes in, is because of that, on top of the kind of more general upgrades you get, modifiers from things like scrolls, which are a different thing. So like the main upgrade will be like kind of a skill tree, right? And that's the 3 sections. And then you'll have a scroll, and the scrolls are modifiers, and those really start to change. Like if you get a legendary modifier of like increasing your damage for the damage you take, you effectively become like a glass cannon build. And so you can like mow down bosses because you're so strong, but if you can hit 4 times, you're dead kind of thing, right? And so that the scroll and the variety of scrolls and stuff, combined with how you're able to kind of build up your skill tree that is related to your class that you picked beforehand, as well as the end result meta progression, similar to something like the Hades Mirror, all combined to make a really satisfying roguelite experience. It's not like in terms of like it doesn't restart all the time, but what I will say it's not balanced, but it doesn't feel broken. Like, there's not a point where it feels like, oh, things have been overtuned, or you can't feel like you can get ahead. You can very easily get ahead, and every class is viable, right? Because you're able to kind of spec into what you do. And certain scrolls, like that ability of Glass Cannon, might work better with something that a class that does more damage. Or maybe it might do better with a class that's focused on movement speed, right? Because the fear of a Glass Cannon is you're going to die too quickly. So if you combine that Glass Cannon sort of scroll with a thing that has high movement, then that might be really good, right? And so there's just a lot of variety there that can keep you playing. And I think that's really good. The one thing I'll say in terms of maybe an indicator of like, to me, the one thing I didn't like about Hades was the fact that it was the same over and over again in terms of that it wasn't, super randomized. And that is a part on this game too. The runs are pretty similar. You're going through the same kind of zones each time to fight the same bosses in a row, similar to something like Hades, right? It is not randomized in any capacity. It's not like Risk of Rain where you're going to activate a thing and it's going to be a random boss, right? It's not like that. But, I mean, that's a very slight, not even complaint, more so just an observation how the game works. And overall, I think I would really highly recommend this game. If any of the footage you've seen seems interesting or anything I've talked about here seems interesting, then you can definitely go check it out. But I do really like the way it marries some of that Doom movement shooter stuff with the Hades progression, as well as kind of the Risk of Rain class design. So, if any of that sounds interesting, make sure you go check it out. And hopefully you enjoy this little insight into Gunfire Reborn. It had a pretty decent launch, I think, for a while when it went 1.0. But just, keep it in the back of your head, keep it on the radar, because it really is a great game. So hopefully you enjoy that, and we'll see everyone next time.